Hello everyone, my name is Jacob, also known as Krovia, and I am the developer of Wartribes. Now, in the beginning of May, I was part of a layoff round at the medical device startup I was working at, and I'm therefore now taking the plunge as a full-time indie dev. Now this was always part of the plan for me. Ever since high school, I've been very into game development. As I entered university, I did have the choice of specializing in game development and going into the industry. But I chose not to, because of the working conditions, the job prospects, and generally what it's like to work as a new developer in the game development industry. I instead went into traditional software. After university, working at a consultancy company for a while. After that, it was this great startup, and just building up savings, experience, and getting ready to one day take the plunge.
What if he makes it?
Right.
Now with that out of the way, let's have a look at the state of Wartribes since my last video. Better to have it and not need it, than need it and not have it, is a lesson I've perhaps taken to heart too well. Looking through the list of stuff I've gotten done in the past 2 months, the big focus has still been on my inventory system, RIS, which was an inventory system I decided to make, as none of the existing inventory solutions I found quite fit my needs. And also, I wanted to make a plugin I could use for basically all my future games. It was initially inspired by UE5 Inventory, which is a free GitHub project that I recommend you check out if you want to make an inventory system. But perhaps I made things too complex, wanted to make it both general to fit pretty much any type of game, as well as multiplayer PvP safe with client-side prediction and server rollback, as well as making it a plugin for the marketplace. These elements work kinda like multipliers on each other, making for a very complex system. Visually it does not look too different compared to what I had before, perhaps with some extra animations playing, but under the hood there's a lot of optimized tracking and validation going on that will be important for a PvP game. As you might be able to see from the footage I'm playing, I've started live streaming over at Twitch at rankeddev every Tuesday at 7 PM CET or 2 PM EDT. So please come by and ask your game dev, Unreal or C++ questions if you like. So while I have gotten quite a lot done with my inventory system, and the system is now functional and playable, there's still a lot of work to be done, as there are edge cases, new features and bugs I need to fix. Getting into details, there's 2 different types of inventory systems in Unreal. There's the struct approach, where all you have is an ID and a quantity, and that's what you pass around between containers. And then there's the object approach, where you have an object per item and you pass those references around different systems. For my system, I went with a struct-based approach, as it makes it easier to dynamically split and merge items, and it can have reduced network overload, as well as allowing having thousands or even millions of items in your game. But that does have complications around tracking dynamic data, accidental duplication and deletion. For defining item properties, we used to use data tables, but are now using data assets, as that's the more modern and flexible approach. Items will have 2 categories of properties. The first is static, which includes the name, icon and type of item. And then we can have dynamic properties, for example damage, other stats, durability, and even the level of rot on individual pieces of meat, which can change from game to game or over the course of a game. Data assets are not good for dynamic data, as there's only really one instance that shouldn't be changed. So to solve this, I have dynamic objects, so the user will define an object type that will be instantiated for each item that needs dynamic data. So with this approach, I end up with a sort of hybrid where I both have the struct-based approach and the object-based approach for dynamic data. But the dynamic data is optional on an item-by-item basis. And in the future, I plan to have a more data-driven approach where I'll be storing the dynamic data in an ECS-like system. To minimize bugs and maximize stability, I've used Unreal's automation system to write comprehensive unit tests for the core logic of the plugin. Unit test works on small individual pieces of logic that can work in isolation, but are often difficult to write and maintain in the context of game development, and are therefore often thrown to the wayside completely. But for complex, isolated systems that don't depend on a lot of visuals, it can be massively beneficial. Unreal's automation system is built to allow both unit testing as well as more complex tests of integrated systems, the latter of which I'll be getting to in the future. My unit tests cover my 3 core components, that is my item container, my inventory component, and my view model that handles UI interactions and client-side prediction. My test setup haven't caught all bugs by any means, but it has helped massively with stability and reducing the number of bugs I'm finding in-game. I will at some point be making a video covering more unit testing and automation features in Unreal. On top of the base inventory system, I've built an optional gear and weapon subsystem. It's not quite as general as the underlying system, as it makes some assumptions about having two hands, playing animations, how we do attacks and consume ammunition. But it should still be able to handle most types of games, from Overwatch to, well, Wartribes. When planning what I needed to do for this weapon subsystem, I initially thought a small checklist on a single issue would be enough to cover what I needed, but I ended up with this massive checklist as I had underestimated the scope and the features I wanted to include. I will be diving more into the details of my inventory plugin in a future video when I release the plugin on the marketplace. I also set up Git LFS, which helps reduce the file size of the Git history, as Git doesn't work well with the Unreal asset files. Additionally, I set up a free Azure Devops page so I can push my repository and not have to worry about local data loss. But I also worked on a few visual aspects of my game. For example, what I call my PCG at home system, or my Foliage manager, that procedurally and deterministically generates procedural foliage. The generated elements can both be harvestable and interactable in various ways. It splits foliage into two types: static, that covers the whole map, and dynamic, that only is generated around the player to reduce the number of, for example, grass instances I have to spawn. Now, I made this system before they originally announced PCG, and I will be integrating PCG into it, as I have verified that PCG can handle runtime on a completely procedural map. Now, to help bring the foliage up to a whole nother level, I added the Prismatiscape plugin made by the talented Unreal game dev and technical artist Prismatica Dev. It allows highly optimized, on-GPU, physical and wind interaction in your foliage, water and even blood, using a mixture of runtime virtual textures, render targets, Niagara Grid 2D and advanced materials. And of course, I'm as always sucking up as many free and cheap assets I can get my hands on. The Epic Free for the Month and Humble bundles in recent weeks have been exceptionally relevant to my game. Speaking of assets, one of the things I've gone back and forth on is whether to use nanite or not. On a first look, for a top-down game where your camera never really gets close to the object, nanite doesn't make a lot of sense, especially considering its noticeable fixed performance cost. But when you take into account potential time savings of not having to simplify assets I find and purchase, for example when I get more realistic packs, it starts sounding like a more reasonable option. Weighing the pros and cons, I'm tentatively planning to not use nanite, at least until Unreal improves it. I haven't completely settled on an art style, but I want to attempt a realistic style. But of course that means I have to bring any stylized or lower poly assets I find up to par. For example, if I wanted to use assets from the current ongoing Titan projects. But I don't have a lot of experience working on assets, so to help remedy that, I too joined the Titan project, the massive Epic plus ArtStation collaboration art jam. It was an excellent opportunity to work towards something as I refresh and build on the art side of my programming heavy skill set. And I don't complain about the free 6 months of Substance Painter that was also provided for everyone participating. The world is split up into several biomes: grasslands, desert, clifftop, volcanic, sulfur, tropic and marshlands. And I'll be showing some footage in the background here from each of them. The latter two biomes are the ones I'm most interested in, as they fit the theme of my game. The project is organized on a huge Discord server with self-organizing groups, and Epic really only stepping in to do moderation and keep things running smoothly. Initially I'd wanted to help out with materials, but there are limited materials to be instances of a few master materials with some limited configuration, so that was less interesting to me. So instead I decided to just come up with a small manageable asset I could bring from concept to in-game as an exercise and a way to build up a first version of an asset workflow for my game. What I went with was a blue mushroom, inspired by one of the more interesting real-life mushrooms I could find. It's simple enough to be interesting, but complex enough to pose a bit of a challenge, and it fits well in my own game as well. I started by getting back into Blender modeling, relearning everything from scratch, which went surprisingly smoothly this time around. Building up a basic shape was simple enough, but things got more complex as I got into sculpting. I wanted to create a really highly detailed high poly mesh that I could bake into a normal map and apply to a lower poly mesh, which is the standard method for non-nanite assets. I struggled for a while getting the gills underneath the mushroom to be deep enough, and while persistence gave some results, I wasn't quite happy with it. I spent 2 of my live streams in Blender and managed to get this version of the mushroom into Unreal in my game. I then decided I wanted to try ZBrush for modeling instead, and I must say I was impressed with how easy it was to pick up. The tools were similar to Blender's modeling tools, but were behaving in a bit more in the way I wanted and expected them to, though the number of brushes and which one to use for what was a bit overwhelming. After I was happy with the final shape, I brought it into Substance Painter, where I was surprised after watching some tutorials about how little painting you actually do. First step was creating a UV map, of course, and I found the way Substance Painter visualizes the lighting on the UV preview to be extremely helpful. The workflow that I found involved creating many layers on top of each other and masking and blending them in various ways to create complexity. Though given the name Substance Painter, I didn't want to get completely cheated out of doing some painting, so I added some dots on the cap for a more stylized look at the end. Going through this, I'd written up a specific workflow that'll help me remember how to do things in the future, as well as have something to iterate on as I improve my workflow. Finally, it was time to add it to the Titan project itself. I didn't feel confident enough to add it prominently in areas other people have created, and I didn't want to create my whole own area from scratch. So I ended up finding a humble, secluded area at the outskirts of the mushroom village and placing it under a tree there. About a month ago, I also got back into Free Mocap, which is a free open source tool for creating mocap animations using just a few webcams. I had set it up and used it a bit before for some of my animations, for example this crafting animation. But I had to go through a lot of troubleshooting and going back and forth, so I didn't have a good workflow yet. So I went through the process again in a more structured way this time, and I managed to build up a workflow. To quickly break down the steps involved, first you have to set up a clean background with a good contrast, set up your cameras of course, and then calibrate using this special board. After you calibrate it, you can start recording. Each recording should ideally start with a clap or some other loud noise that'll help the system calibrate and synchronize the footage from the different cameras. After that, you simply record your movements, and that'll create an export you can put into Blender. In Blender, you can clean it up a bit and export it using a certain plugin for Unreal Engine. After which, all you have to do is retarget it to your specific skeleton. Now, I didn't end up creating any good animations this time around, but I will be getting back into it soon now that I have a solid workflow I can build upon. Now, I also got back into some AI music generation. At the moment, I think the best software out there is Udio here. And the track you're hearing right now is one of my generations. I really think the quality is getting to a level where it's completely usable for example, background music for games. So, what will I be working on next? Well, first of all, I'll be continuing work on my inventory system. I can't completely promise it'll be done by the next video, but I will make significant progress. Then I plan on getting a new character model into the game. I plan on adding gathering, harvesting, and hunting. And then there's one key activity in game dev I've been neglecting, and that's prototyping. I really want to prototype my combat system and get it as fun as possible so that it serves as a basis for the rest of the game. Another goal is AI improvements, both for combat and for interacting with the environment. Once I have these elements into the game, I believe the core gameplay loop I have now, where you fight waves of enemies, will be a lot more fun and engaging, and it'll serve as a basis to build upon. These are ambitious goals in the short term, but I remain committed. Thank you so much for watching. Don't be afraid to leave a comment below, hit subscribe if you want to see more, and I'll see you next time.